Well, hey everybody, welcome back. This is April 30th, and this is Living Power, your online Bible study where we are walking through the Bible in a year. It is an exciting time in our reading. We have been talking about the life of David, and over the past couple of days, there was a lot happening, especially with David's son Absalom and other members of his family. And what I'd like to do today is to kind of give you some explanation as to a couple of the things in your reading. I'm not going to really cover too much over the last couple of days, only to remind us that David is experiencing strife in his family, and it is as a result of his adultery with Bathsheba and committing murder against her husband. Remember, the Lord had said that there will be some things happen to him because of that, and one of the things was strife in his family. Certainly we're seeing that with Absalom trying to take over the throne and having killed his half-brother a couple of days ago. We also see a second part of that judgment come true over the past couple of days when Absalom slept with the concubines, 10 of David's concubines. And if you recall, if you don't know the prophecy that the Lord said this is going to happen, you read that and you go, wow, that is really strange. Because remember, Absalom put up a tent on top of the palace so that everyone kind of knew what was happening. I mean, I don't think it was in full view of everyone, but everybody knew what was going on. And that was a real slap in the face to David. Well, to explain that, remember God said that because David had taken the wife of another, that his wives would be taken by another in full public view. And certainly that did come to pass. So if you're wondering where I got that, you can look back at the section on David and Bathsheba, specifically when Nathan the prophet comes to David to confront him, and that's where that was. We also saw a couple days ago that David is restored as king, and today we're going to talk about how he comes back into Jerusalem and how the tribes respond to him coming home. So that's interesting. Today we see an argument over the king, and I've entitled today's lesson A Revolutionary Suggestion. And the verse that I've pulled out is 2 Samuel 20, verse 1. Sheba began to chant, "Down with the dynasty of David." Now, in the reading, you remember Sheba was this guy, and he was cursing David. He was obviously from long ago from the side of Saul, the prior king, and he is chanting something that we've not heard before. But I want you to make sure that you take note of it, you don't overlook it, and you remember it, because "Down with the dynasty of David" will be heard again. And it certainly isn't going to happen today. It's not going to happen in the next couple of days. But later on, even after his son Solomon's rule, something incredible happens. And I'm not saying that it's incredibly good. I'm just saying let's remember this part, that someone is beginning to chant, "Down with the dynasty of David," and we're beginning to see an argument. The 10 tribes of Israel, which are the northern tribes, versus the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. We're starting to see a bit of a split here in their attitudes and their should we say their desires. I don't want to give you too much of what's coming, but just realize that in 2 Samuel 19:43 it says there are 10 tribes in Israel, and that doesn't mean 10 total tribes. Remember, Judah was considered Judah and Benjamin, and Israel was considered the 10 northern tribes. Notice how fickle Israel is, and it's not just them. People in general are so fickle, and they get mad at David because they are not allowed to come in with him and bring him back into Judah. It's kind of I'm not going to say a silly reason to get mad, but it's an unhonorable reason. I like to say it that way. It's an unhonorable reason to get mad. You won't let me help you, so I'm going to get angry with you. Sounds like they were looking for a good reason to get angry, and they found it. So Judah escorts David back into Jerusalem. He takes his position back on the throne, and Absalom is dead, his son that was trying to usurp the throne. And remember, a couple of days ago I had mentioned he had really long hair, and to remember that about the hair. Well, today we read why. Because his hair, as he was riding his horse in the forest, his hair got stuck in a tree. It didn't kill him, but it held him, and he couldn't get out. And then Joab, the commander of David's army, saw him and actually killed him. So that's what happened to Absalom. David is grieved, very grieved over this. And I think it was Joab, wasn't it, that eventually came back and said, look, you are grieving. You are making it look like we've done this terrible thing. Your son was trying to take over the throne. Get over it and become king. Sit here as king. So he kind of brushes himself off. He goes back to the city gate. And remember, the city gate was kind of like the courthouse of our cities today. The city gate was the place where people would come. It was the internet of that day, where you'd learn about news and decisions were made. And so he went back to the city gate and kind of took his place as king. We also see today a famine had gone on in the land for 3 years. And it said, then David inquired of the Lord what was going on. I wonder why he didn't inquire of the Lord sooner. But it doesn't exactly say when he did. It just says the famine had gone on for 3 years. And we are given insight a little bit into the reason for the famine, and that was judgment that God was bringing down on Israel because of something that Saul had done that was not yet made right. The judgment on Saul was for murdering the Gibeonites. Now, if you need help remembering what that was all about, that was back in Joshua 9. Do you remember when Saul was first king? And I guess what happened was he killed some Gibeonites during his tenure. When, it's not really that important, but know that he did have blood on his hands and he killed Gibeonites. Now, why was he not supposed to kill the Gibeonites? This is the main thing to remember. In Joshua 9, when Joshua and the Israelites were coming into the promised land, the Gibeonites came and disguised themselves. They were one of the people groups that the Lord had said to wipe out. Well, the Gibeonites had heard of the ferociousness and the skill that the Israelites had, and they knew, as did the surrounding peoples, that the Israelites' God was fighting for them, and they feared for their life, as they should. Well, they made it look like they'd been traveling a long distance to make it look like they weren't who they really were, that they weren't from right there. And Joshua made a pact with them that they would protect the people. Later, it was revealed that, these are the Gibeonites. We shouldn't have made a pact with them, but they honored their pact and they were protected. Now, I think that says here that God certainly wants us all to honor the commitments and the promises that we make. And this judgment was on Saul for not upholding that commitment that Joshua had made on behalf of the Israelites. So David realizes it, and he goes to them and he says, what can I do? And they said, we want the sons of Saul. Basically, they were enacting lex talionis, which is the concept of an eye for an eye. Saul had killed the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites wanted Saul's son to be handed over them for execution. And it's so sad to read about the mom that had to give up her sons, knowing that they would go to die. That was a really sad part of the reading. The rains came, the famine was over, and the curse was broken. Now, let's look at a couple of things about David. David is a man after God's own heart, and I always like to look for reasons in Scripture why God calls him that. This was not something that he called himself. This was something that God, actually a term that God named for him. And here are a couple of things that I noticed in today's reading that contribute to that. How did David respond to all that was happening? It's so easy in our humanness to want to retaliate, to not be kind to our enemies, to not go over and above board in kindness to people who are not kind to us. That is common. Well, here are some uncommon things that David was doing. David allowed Amasa to command part of his army. Amasa was Absalom, his son that tried to usurp the throne, Absalom's army commander. So here Amasa was fighting on the other side, but in a gesture of reconciliation, David allows him to come in and fight on his side. Second thing, he spared Shimei, which was the guy that was cursing David. Third thing, he was hearing out Mephibosheth. Why weren't you there? Remember, Mephibosheth was one of the last sons of Saul, and he was one of the last sons of Jonathan. He was the grandson of Saul, and David had heard that he heard an untruth about Mephibosheth, so he was had been deceived, and he just asked him a question. Why were you not there? This is such a great lesson for all of us. We can be told something by a person that might be a lie. We can be deceived by the devil. But until we check directly with that person, we're going to have strife in our heart for that person, and we should always validate our assumptions, and we should always check before we even start to feel bad about something that we think someone has done to us. It's, 9 times out of 10 when I do that, I realize that I've misunderstood the situation and the person didn't do it, or I interpret it incorrectly. So David was hearing him out. 4, he gave Ziba some land in spite of the lie. Ziba was the one who had lied about Mephibosheth, but yet he still gave Ziba some of the land that Saul had, in spite of his lie. And then the 10 concubines, he let them go off, be at peace. They'd been raped, essentially, and forced against their will by Absalom. And so David did not insist that they continue on as his concubines. He let them be at peace. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention to you today was the strife between Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah. I mentioned it at the beginning of the tape today, the lesson today. But for the first time, we see them saying, "You didn't give us honor in helping you cross the Jordan. We are the 10 tribes and have 10 times as much right as you do." Sheba said in 20, verse 1, "We have no interest in the son of Jesse," a revolutionary suggestion. And I mentioned that to you earlier. But I'm going to remind you again, just to keep it in mind, something happens after Solomon's reign to the kingdom, and it's very important to remember this. A revolutionary suggestion has been planted in their minds. One thing you might have missed in 2 Samuel 8, we read before that David gave sort of a bureaucratic list of who his top commanders were. Here in today's reading in 2 Samuel 20, verse 23 to 26, we also see a list, but there's 2 things that are different. Did you notice those 2 things? You might want to stop the tape and go back and look. But I'll go ahead and tell you what they are. One of which is a slave labor force that they did not have before. There is someone in charge of the labor force, and that's new. So we know that there was slave labor under Solomon, but it started under David. And it started during the last couple of years of his reign. David's son, second thing, they're not listed as advisors here, which probably was due to all the strife that he had in his family, and he's just not included them in his top officials any longer. At the end of the reading, David again fights a giant. These are the same Philistine giants. They are huge people. They've just got big bones in their jeans. They are literally 9-10 feet tall. And this is later in his life. Notice this time he can't do it. He's about to be killed by the Philistine giant. Someone comes in to save him, and then the men all come together and say, "No more fighting for you. You are finished. Your days of fighting are over. You are too important to us for us to lose you in battle." He is nearing the end of his life. He is getting older. The good thing to know here is that the terror caused by the Philistines is at an end, which we talked about a little bit before. Well, there was a lot going on over the last couple of days, a lot going on in the reading today. I hope that clarified a couple of things for you. Tomorrow we're going to read a lesson entitled Scale Your Wall, and it's a lesson of an encouragement and courage. You won't want to miss it. So that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Stay faithful to your reading, and I will see you again next time. Shalom.